In this video, we're going to be comparing Clare Graves' FS system or spiral dynamics in green, Jane Loevinger's individualistic stage, and Robert Kegan's 4.5 stage of development. We're going to be looking at what these forms of mind seem to have in common, how they seem to be different, at least according to me, and what we might approximately say about human beings and their psychology based upon this. Again, according to me. That me, by the way, is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis, the log. So, let's start with Kegan's 4.5 stage. Remember that Kegan's self-authoring mind, or stage 4, that person is subject to his own inner authority. His own form of mind, if you will. And this is a mind that is supported by modernity. So it's a mind that very often will value science and objectivity and reason and formal operations being at their peak. You know, a sharp divide between subjects and objects, a world of seemingly separate objects that can be analyzed, weighed, and measured. Um, so when this begins to be taken as logic, what happens then is a new appreciation of subjectivity begins to emerge. The person begins to see more of the subjectivity behind the objectivity that was so cherished, usually at stage 4. It is seen that any way of understanding something, any form of mind, any way of making meaning is per definition incomplete and simultaneously a way of not knowing. So there's often more of a curiosity, not only in terms of learning new facts and new skills and stuff like that, but to encounter new ways of knowing, other ways of making meaning. So there might be more of a curiosity as to other people's subjectivity and how they make sense of the world and what is it like to be them, and also a new appreciation for their own subjectivity. There will be less of a tendency to, in the words of Daniel Kahneman, to confuse internal coherency, meaning that an idea is well argued in a sense or seems reasonable, to confuse that with wholeness or completely getting something, more of a map territory distinction. So you tend to get a more relativistic way of thinking with a deeper appreciation of context and contextual factors. Um, this might be a space that's a bit uncomfortable to be in, because there's often a deconstruction then of agency and personal authority and personal autonomy as the person, generates an increased sensitivity for context and interconnectedness and not knowing, a deeper access to feelings and subjectivity. But the person might not yet obviously have really created a new form of knowing yet. So it can feel a little bit unstabling to operate from this particular place. Now, given that the person has more distance to their own form of mind or their own way of knowing, they tend to become more open to feedback. not just more open to feedback in terms of bettering their own system, which is very typical for that self-authored stage, that I'm very interested in feedback for me to improve and to learn new things and to sharpen my own arguments. But they tend to become more curious about feedback that can point them to the limitations of their own form of mind. Feedback that can shake up their own way of knowing. And this is a huge strength. So in terms of conflict then, instead of conflict, looking like something that, okay, you and I have this long-term conflict because you are different. You have this form of mind and I have this form of mind, and I can kind of try to visit you and see if I can understand you or walk a mile in your shoes. Um, Instead of solving a conflict, there might be more of this idea that a conflict can solve you. There's this conception that if you have a long-term conflict, then maybe you are overly identified with one aspect of a polarity, and the other person seems to hold the other part of the polarity for you. And that the conflict can solve you in the sense that it's an invitation for you to not pretend to be complete. It's an invitation for you to recover more of your own complexity, to find more internally of what the other person seems to be holding. Now, this is still Kegan stage 4.5, so there's still this sense of two different system that functions kind of independently of each other. And very often a quest to kind of continually improve one's own self system. There's still an identification with form, self as form. Now, looking at ego development theory, then, as Jane Loevinger and Susanne Greuter would point out, when people move towards the achiever stage or that conscientious stage, um, there's a process of seeing more, learning more, discovering patterns, discovering pieces of the puzzle, creating distinctions, creating the ability for abstract thinking, for formal operations, to develop a autonomous, independent sense of self, right? And the achiever stage is kind of the accomplishment of that. Here, formal operations is at its peak. A stark divide between subject in here and the world out there, a world that seems to consist of a multiplicity of separate objects, distinct from a separate subject, and that we can objectively kind of measure and weigh and figure out how the world works. When But when people begin to move beyond that, and the individualist stage being the first stage of that, uh, people begin to again gain some perspective on that alleged objectivity. So there's usually more of an inward search. The head trips become less appealing. There's more of a connection with feelings and the body. Instead of this achiever mindset that's so focused on the external world and of achieving and reasons and causes and being obsessed with the future and future achievement, there's more an appreciation of the now, of the present moment, of really enjoying and cherishing or experience. There's an emphasis on being instead of having and doing. There's more of a curiosity of how other people see the world and what their subjective experience is like, and a more relativistic form of orientation. Because you begin to see that, wait a minute, this is just one vantage point. This is just one way of looking at things. And other people have other ways of looking at things. And a lot of this is culturally kind of conditioned in. A deeper appreciation for interpretation and the power of context. So, what might happen here, and a very large strength here, I think, is that if you look at, for example, medicine as a field, the way medical school, and I haven't gone to medical school, but I know a lot of people who have, and I've talked to them about it in different countries. So, medical school is very much this formal operations, scientific reasons, causes, emphasis on objectivity. The primary metaphor very often in medical training is the body as a machine of sorts. That form of knowing. So let's say you have a medical doctor or a patient or even a medical school that were to move beyond formal operations or that achiever mindset. It's not that you would leave science or reason or these sorts of things behind, but now in looking at disease, you might also begin to look more at a person's meaning making, more at culture and social factors and contextual factors. You might find wisdom in other ways of knowing in addition to the strictly scientific one. Consider law school. You know, a lot of lawyers seem to operate from that. Uh, in ego development, they have a stage called the self-aware stage or the expert stage, which is situated between the conformist and the achiever, or in spiral dynamics terms, between blue and orange. Here you very often have the technocrat, the bureaucrat, the person who is no longer fused with the group, but it's more of a crafts logic. They're identified with their particular form of expertise or profession, and it's that particular logic that counts, and they want to be the experts themselves. This is often the pain in the ass bureaucrats. You know, both Graves, by the way, and ego development kind of describes this form of mind, if you will, right? So, but I remember talking to a rather well-known lawyer here in Norway, and I asked him if he had ever studied memory. You know, because what they're kind of using as a tool all day is when, you know, interviewing people, you know, on the bench or in court is memory. And he looked at me and he said, "But Jurgen, I've studied law. I haven't studied psychology." This idea that you could have a good criminal justice system and exclusively study law, that you don't have to look at psychology, meaning making, culture, context. You don't have to look at any of the subjectivity behind the alleged objectivity or the cultural contexts out of which a lot of this stuff emerges. Or the same idea that you can look at disease or medicine exclusively from this kind of objectivistic, rationalistic, um, body as a machine type metaphor, and essentially leave the entire human being out of it. So, one thing that very often seems to happen is that people begin to broad out and become curious about other perspectives in addition with that more relativistic style thinking. Now, moving over to Clare Graves' FS or spiral dynamics green system. Here you have this theme again of sacrifice self now for acceptance now, or sacrifice now so that the entire group can have now. It's this self-sacrifice system again. Um, Here there's an emphasis again. So the theory kind of goes that Orange Man or ER Man, who was obsessed with status and accomplishment and earning money and upgrading the wife and the car and stuff like that, might have his success, but he might be respected but not liked, and he lacks the human connection. So now there's this compulsion to belong and to be part of something. So here again, also a more relativistic way of thinking. If the thinking style in Orange or ER was multiplistic, meaning there are many ways of thinking, but one that is right, very often determined by scientific evidence, and the blue system was absolutistic, here you have a more relativistic both and thinking style. More doubts. Um, Subjectivity being valued more than objectivity. Getting along being valued more than getting ahead. Connecting and being part of something being valued more than competing or standing out. Sensitivity being valued more than cold rationality. Uh, Class or style, in a sense, being valued more than crass materialism. So at this stage, people then might more be concerned with things like environmentalism and nature and these sorts of things. Um, there's a little thing here though there seems to be quite a few things in common here, but one thing that's always troubled me with Graves' work, and I'm taking this again from Graves's book. I think this is the best book if you want to look at spiral dynamics, by the way. That if you look at how Kegan conceptualizes the socialized mind or the third order, that someone becomes socialized by essentially becoming part of society and society becoming part of him. That's exactly how Graves defines his sixth stage or FS system or green in spiral dynamics. But this is supposed to become after that orange or ER stage. And what I've noticed as someone who has grown up in Scandinavia, I've lived in Norway almost my entire life, is that, over here, you kind of get socialized into those types of values. They're kind of the typical progressive left leaning values of feminism and environmentalism and multiculturalism and political correctness and sensitivity and these more soft values, if you will. You get socialized into that. So you have a lot of teenagers and young people who go around talking like that, but they don't exercise both and logic. They don't have a sensitivity to context. It's not really a relativistic thinking style. So I think Graves might have made a little mistake here. And of course, there's a lot of people too who create kind of their own self-authored identity out of these values as well. And one thing that has struck me, which I would love to see Susanne Greuter or Robert Kegan, these folks who are still alive, address, they all seem to connect this stage of development highly to postmodernism. So essentially, the blue system, Kegan stage three, Susanne Jane Loevinger's conformist, kind of being typical of traditional societies more. And then you having the orange, the achiever stage, the self-authoring mind, kind of being the mindset of modernity. And they seem to imply that postmodernism is kind of the context for this form of mind. One thing I would like to see them address is Stephen Hicks' criticism, the philosopher Stephen Hicks' criticism of postmodernism. He conceptualizes postmodernism as a political strategy of the neo Marxists, meaning that the Marxist used to think of socialism as scientific socialism. It was kind of a modernist conception of economics, and they have this idea that science would vindicate Marxism. But then by the mid to late 50s, it became very obvious to any observer who cared about facts that all of Marx's main propositions had been proven false. The capitalists won that economic battle. So, so now, and this is Hicks's proposition, the Marxists, instead of adjusting their philosophy, they instead waged a war on truth and objectivity and reason and evidence. And instead of focusing exclusively on class and economics, they would expand this to be about, you know, the oppressed and the oppressors, racism, sexism, and of course we see this today with this whole woke, politically correct ideology with cancel culture and trigger warnings, and there's supposed to be no biological sex, and group identity is supposed to be more important than anything, and everything is about the oppressors versus those who are oppressed. And the logic of these different groups are so different than that reason and communicating essentially has very little value. Um, they seem to be dominating culturally at the moment. But if you look at the thinking style among those who seem to push the postmodern agenda, there seems to be a combination of absolutism and relativism. You know, in these kind of paradoxes, there's no truth, and that's the truth, right? No culture is any better or worse than any other, except the Western one that kind of sucks and is full of racists and colonialism and imperialism and stuff like that. No set of values are any better or worse than anyone else, outside of sexism and racism, which is objectively bad. So there seems to, these folks don't, for the most part, seem to be relativists. They seem to be absolutists, and they are exactly the people who want to take away freedom of speech and rule of law and stuff like that, right? So that would be interesting to see them address that. To what extent is it really fair to claim that postmodernism is tightly associated with a psychological stage of increased psychological perspective going further than modernity or the achiever stage? And to what extent is this a political strategy of the neo Marxists? Consider this too, as Stephen Hicks with make a point out of. If these people were really championing diversity, uh, why are pretty much all of these postmodernists on the extreme left politically? Why aren't they all over the political landscape? If you look at Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and all of these folks, they're all extreme or far left. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I would love to hear your comments. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at Kegan Stage 5, Spiral Dynamics Yellow, and Ego Development's Autonomous Stage. Till then, have fun.